Hi, welcome to this session for School of Ops on costing and pricing. To start off, we'll talk a little bit about why some of the costing and pricing is important and what we'll go through in this session. The first one is understanding how much my cloud costs, different opportunities and different ways that I can actually go and save money. Doing showback or showing how much my VMs cost to the VM owners or the users of the virtual machines. And then the last one is doing chargeback for virtual machines. So to start off, I'd like to point out the cost homepage. So this is the place you initially go to look at costs of the environment. So you see there's multiple tabs across here. So there's the tab for the on-prem costs. So you can see the total cost of ownership broken down by different perspectives, by capacity, cost drivers, and data centers. And then you see the breakdown of the potential savings in the environment. So these are all the recommendations where you can go and save money. And then the realized savings. So this is all of the changes that have been done into the environment that resulted in savings. So really great place to start. But you also notice there's some other tabs on here for VMware Cloud and AWS and Azure VMware Solution. And then there's also the public cloud environments for a native AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. So this is the kind of the go-to launching point now for looking at costing. And then there's a selection of dashboards that you can click to get more in-depth info on the various cost components. So the other piece for costing is the what-if analysis. So this is all of your planning scenarios. So this is like adding and removing virtual machines, adding and removing hosts, migrating to different clouds, whether it's a hybrid cloud or VMware Cloud or public cloud, or then also doing comparisons of costs between your own private clouds. So all of the what-if scenarios actually relate to costing. So they're not just capacity; they're also cost. So to kind of dig into some of the details that you get, so going a little bit more in depth on the cost homepage, we have some built-in dashboards that can help you dive in and get a better understanding of how much your environment costs. So the first one here is the total cost of ownership. So this has a lot of the similar info that was on the cost landing page. But you can see like your trends over time of how much the various components cost and the breakdowns. So you kind of get that trend over time, which is the important part. There's another dashboard for potential cost savings. So again, this helps you get in, see a little more deeper into the cost savings for the environment. So this gives you breakdowns by idle virtual machines, powered off VMs, snapshots, orphan disks, oversized virtual machines, and reclaimable hosts. And then on the other side is the optimization opportunities. So these are your undersized virtual machines that need additional resources to be able to work at their full potential. And then there's realized cost savings. Again, like I was saying before, this is looking at changes you actually did in the environment, and then how much the impact that had to the cost. So this is things like powering off or deleting an idle virtual machine, deleting a powered up virtual machine, deleting snapshots that were marked as reclaimable, deleting orphan disks, right-sizing oversized virtual machines, or deleting reclaimable hosts, et cetera. So if you perform any of these actions, the system will detect those and automatically track those savings over time. So this dashboard helps you dive in and look at what you've actually saved over time. So really great in digging into that, what's going on. So I talked a little bit about reclamation and some of the cost savings. So you can also go to the reclaim page in vRealize operations, and that helps you see the breakdowns by individual virtual machines and perform the actions on those virtual machines. So this is lets you actually delete or power off virtual machines that are idle, or delete powered off virtual machines, delete snapshots, delete orphan disks, et cetera. You can even launch into things like Automation Central if you want to schedule some of these actions and automate the cleanup of the environment. That can be done as well. And then right sizing, I know that's a big one when you're talking with when you're trying to get an optimal cloud and do the best cost optimized environment that you can. So we have this VM right sizing details dashboard, which actually goes in and shows you details about the right sizing recommendations, what the recommendations are, and then gives you the potential savings related to right sizing. So basically, if you right size and oversize or undersize virtual machines, it gives you that projection on how much savings you could potentially get for each virtual machine. So again, this helps you get down to the the next level of detail. And then the next one I wanted to point out here is reclaimable hosts. So this is using the capacity engine by vRealize operations to figure out what the optimal size of a cluster should be based on the projected utilization. And then it can identify how many hosts you can actually reclaim from a cluster and still run the workload. So the idea here is you can actually go and reclaim these hosts and reuse them somewhere else, maybe in another cluster where you need additional capacity. But we actually track how many hosts you can reclaim from a cluster, and then what your potential savings would be from reclaiming those hosts. And again, this is for cost deferral, so you can actually repurpose those hosts for the reasons. So the big point when you're looking at cost, when talking about a lot of customers, is actually looking at doing show back. So this is actually wanting to show the end users how much their virtual machines or their containers or the pods actually cost to run in the environment. So we actually have two built-in show back dashboards. So one shows the VM costs, and this is broken down based on groups. So this can be things from VRA objects. These can be custom groups. These can be VM folders. These can be broken down by basically any object that's in vRealize operations. You select it, and then you can see the cost of all the virtual machines related to that group that you select. And there's another dashboard for the vSphere pods. So we actually can help look at the cost of vSphere pods as well. So you just select the group, and then it'll show you the cost of all those pods. And then it gives you the potential savings for each of those if there are savings opportunities. So now we kind of want to dive in a little bit more and about how the costing works and how you can do some of the configuration to get it to work the way makes most sense for you. So the first one is talking about the cost allocation process. So the important part to know at this point is the system will basically starts from the cluster cost, and it calculates what we call base rate. So this is the cost per gigahertz of CPU usage, or per gigabyte of RAM that's used, or a gigabyte of disk space. So it figures out what that rate would be for the virtual machines. And then once it has that rate, it can then use that rate to calculate the cost of the virtual machine. So how it goes from the base rate to the VM cost is something that you can actually go and configure. So there's basically three different ways you can do that configuration. So kind of talk through each of the options here, and I'll tell you how to go and configure them. So the first one is usable capacity after HA and buffer. So this is relying upon basically what you expect to be able to use in that cluster. And then from that, the system calculates the base rate, as the name implies, from the usable capacity after HA and buffer, based on the cost drivers, and then it changes infrequently. So basically, because it's based on the capacity of the cluster, it shouldn't fluctuate that much. The VM cost is then based on the VM's utilization times the base rates. So it looks at what the VM is actually consuming from CPU, memory, and disk space, multiplies it by the appropriate base rate to get the cost of the virtual machine. So when you're using this mode, the cost of the unused resources is tracked in a metric called unallocated cost. So if you want to improve the efficiency, that's that's the metric you want to track. Look at your unallocated cost. Unallocated cost is basically the cost of the capacity that's remaining, that's not used, that you can still grow into. So you want to minimize the unallocated cost as much as possible to get a more cost optimized environment. On the other hand, when you look at the middle here, the actual utilization mode, so this one actually looks at the base rates, and it defines the base rates based on the cluster's utilization. So if the cluster has high utilization, your base rates will be lower. If the cluster has low utilization, your base rates would be higher. So it can vary from day to day because the utilization of the cluster changes from day to day. The VM cost itself is still functions the same way, so it's the utilization times the base rate. But because we're based on the cost based on what's actually used in the cluster, the cost of the unused resources actually ends up being distributed across all the virtual machines in the environment. So essentially, there would be no unallocated costs. So if you have a cluster running one VM, basically the cost of that VM would be the cost of the entire cluster. If you had 100 VMs, then each virtual machine would get a smaller portion of the cost of that cluster. So the decision between these two basically is how you want to handle the cost of those unused resources. Do you want to track it as a separate metric as unallocated cost, or do you want to increase the cost of the virtual machines that are in the cluster and just distribute that unallocated cost, the unused cost across all the other virtual machines? That's really the difference between those two is the cost of unused resources. And then the last option here is allocation model. So this one works completely different. So this one actually, the base rates are based on the overcommit ratios. So say you define an 8 vCPU per core, it's based off of that ratio. So it really is not, it doesn't use the utilization at all. It's based on what is allocated to the virtual machines, and then the amount of what you expect to be able to run in the cluster based on those overcommit ratios. So the thing here is the base rates here won't change very often either, because your overcommit ratios and the capacity of the cluster don't really change that often. The VM cost, this one is different. So we actually look at the configuration of the virtual machine times the base rate. So if it has 2 vCPUs, you multiply that by the per vCPU base rate, and then that'll get you your CPU cost. So there's no utilization involved in the allocation model. And then the cost of unused resources, again, this one is actually tracked as a separate metric, so of unallocated cost. So if you're not using all the vCPUs that are potentially usable in a cluster, the cost of those unused vCPUs gets tracked as unallocated cost. So that's very similar to the first one here. So with that, I'll talk about how you can go and configure these options. So the first one here is looking at, so when you go to the cost settings page, on the cluster cost, you can actually go in and change it from usable capacity after HA and buffer to actual utilization between those two. So these are the utilization-based costs, your two options. And I know I talked about the usable capacity after HA and buffer, kind of tell you a little bit of how that works. So when you look at the capacity of a cluster, you have things like your resources needed for HA. Those are automatically taken out. And then buffer. So these are the settings you can set on policy. These go above and beyond what you set for HA. And then when you subtract those, you end up with what's called usable capacity after HA and buffer. So that basically has taken out your HA and buffer components. And then everything else that's left is your usable capacity after HA and buffer. So if you're looking at, make sure admission control is handled, or you have enough, like if you have a stretch cluster, you want to be able to, take into account the additional capacity needed in the other half of the cluster. You can do that by either setting admission control for the HA piece or by setting buffers. So I know this is a capacity setting, but this also affects the way the cost works when you're using the usable capacity after HA and buffer mode. And then the other option were allocation model. So the allocation model, you can actually go and enable on the cluster capacity settings as well. So there's a section there for allocation model. So you just need to untick the lock and then set your overcommit ratio. So you don't have to set all three. You can just set CPU and leave memory and disk space as demand if you wanted to. It's up to you on which ones you want to enable. The costing will work regardless. So if you only enable it for CPU, just CPU would be allocation based for costing. And then if you left memory as demand, then it would use demand for memory cost. So it's kind of flexible in that, but once you enable allocation model, that will switch costing over to allocation based for whichever resource you enable, whether CPU, memory, or disk space. So, okay, so with that, let me switch over and I will show you how we kind of break down from the, how we get to the, basically to the cost of the cluster. So the first option here is talking about cost driver-based costs. So this applies to your on-premises vSphere environments. So we start off, we have what we call cost drivers. So these are basically things you can configure to say what your actual expenses are for your environment. So these are things like setting how much you actually paid for your physical servers, how much it costs for your storage, license, applications, network, maintenance facilities, so on and so forth. So these where you can go in and modify these to reflect what you actually paid for these various resources. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go and configure all these. We have what's called a cost reference database. So these are the default costs. So we have some researchers that have gone and figured out what the industry standard numbers are. And those are what we call the cost reference. So if you wanted to, you could just leave them the defaults, or you can go and modify the cost drivers to customize them to be just just specifically for you. So we do have the ability to both import and export cost drivers. So I know we've had several customers, that are been asking for the ability to do these bulk operations. So you can go in and export them, manipulate them in a spreadsheet if you wanted to, and then re-import them. So it's definitely possible to do that now. Another thing, so when we're dealing with servers that you purchase, so these are not servers that are leased, these are servers that you've purchased. The system will actually go and do depreciation for you. So you can go in and set your depreciation settings, so from 2 to 5 years, and then you choose your depreciation model that you use, whether it's straight line or max of double or straight. And then once you set this up, then the system for any server that you marked as server that you purchased, it will automatically do the depreciation for you based on the purchase date that you entered in the cost driver. So now, how does this look when we add in the cost driver based costs? So I already talked about the cost allocation process earlier. So now what we have is we bring in our cost drivers, we factor in our depreciation if necessary, and then that then feeds into our cluster cost. So this is the way it works now. We go from the cost drivers all the way down, kind of fill in that gap. So we can now feed it all the way down to the cost of the virtual machines. Okay, so the next option here is what we're calling bill-based cost. So bill-based costing actually currently is supported with VMware Cloud on AWS. And the way that works is the vRealize operations can actually connect into the cloud services portal, and it collects the bill. So it tracks how much you spend for your VMC environment over time. You can get breakdowns based on your subscriptions, whether they're on demand or if you have a 1 or 3 year subscription. It tracks your history. It can track all of this stuff over time for you. And then what's nice is when you have to select this billing enabled, and this actually tells the system to go and actually start collecting the bill. And once it has that, it can start doing the costing based on that bill. I also mentioned, we do have the ability to add in a few cost drivers that apply to VMware Cloud and AWS. So these are the ability to customize your license costs. And then this is also gives you ability to add in additional costs. So these are additional costs like per VMs based on tags if you wanted to. So a way of additionally tweaking and customizing the cost of the VMC environment. So how does that look? Now, compared to the other ones we've shown, here's the cost allocation process. We go from the cluster cost to the base rates to the VM cost based on the configurations that I already showed. So now what we do is we go in and we find our VMC SCDCs, we collect our bill, and then from our bill, we feed that into the cluster cost. So now we've connected the gap here now between going from the bill now to the cluster cost, and the cluster cost goes all the way down to the VM. So hopefully that makes sense. That gives us our ability to do our bill-based costing now. We've got our costs now coming directly from the bill. Okay, so the next section here is talking about rate card-based costing. So this section applies to VMware Cloud on AWS, AVS, and GCVE. So from here, what you can do is you have the ability to customize and edit your rate cards for various cloud providers. So you can see here on the cost settings page, we go to the cloud providers tab, and you see we have options here for VMware Cloud on AWS, Azure VMware Solution, and Google Cloud VMware Engine. So you can download these rate cards, customize them, and re-upload them back through the same wizard. And this gives you ability. This adjusts the cost you see from a costing perspective, as well as the what if scenarios that I mentioned previously. So if you do the what if to add VMs, it affects those costs as well. So you want to go through and modify the rate cards as needed to match what you actually pay for the environment. And like I said, this works for VMC on AWS, for AVS, and GCVE. There's a couple of other settings that you can modify for each of those VMware Cloud providers as well. So you can go in and modify the ratio, so the CPU memory to storage. So this basically tells the system how you want to break down the cost. So what percentage of the cost of the cluster goes to CPU, what percentage, what ratio goes to memory, and how much goes to storage. So it helps tweak those numbers there. If you want to increase the cost of memory, you can adjust these numbers to account for that. And then we have two other options here for the discount. So we can specify a discount in percentage, and then we can select the region where we want to apply that discount. So this is above and beyond the rate cards that I just talked about. So if you have one region that is cheaper, you can go in and modify the discount and add additional discount from a region by region basis. So how does that fit into the VM cost calculation? So you see on the right, we still have the same process. We have the cluster cost, base rates going to the VM cost. And then now what we do is we add in our rate card on the left. So we find our SDDCs, we look up our rate cards, and then from there, that feeds into our cluster cost. So we've connected the gaps again here. Now, basically, we derive our cluster cost from the rate cards, and then the same process works from the cluster on down to do the allocation of the cost. Okay, so the next piece, I want to switch topics a little bit. So I've been talking about costing and showback. Now I want to add in another concept here called pricing and chargeback. So I'd like to just kind of define some of the terms here just to make sure if you understand what I mean when I say cost and showback versus price and chargeback. So cost and showback is basically showing how much it costs to run the virtual machines. So the cost is how much you spent. That's like your expenses. How much you actually paid for the servers. How much as the provider, how much you paid to your vendors to be able to run the virtual machines. And then showback is basically creating a report or dashboard, basically showing those costs to someone else. It could be the owner, it could be management, or anybody that wants to look at the costs. So showback is a report based on cost. So then we add on price and chargeback. So chargeback is when you actually want to create a bill or charge the internal customer for running the virtual machines in the cloud. So a price is basically how much you want to charge for a particular virtual machine. This can be based on either cost or allocation. And the price of the virtual machine doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the costs. You can define them. You can define it based on cost or based on something else. And then you can add in things like upcharges and profit and other various services on top of the cost. And then chargeback, basically that is a report that lets you create the bill that you use to show the customer how much you want to charge them for the virtual machines. So hopefully that makes sense, the difference between the cost and showback versus price and chargeback. So now what I want to talk about is we have, just like I showed showback dashboard before, we actually have chargeback dashboard. So you can go in, we have the same groups listed here. I can select my group, and then I can see the prices of the virtual machines. I can see the distribution of the prices for all the virtual machines in that group. And then I can see my, my opportunities to improve the environment. So, deleting powered off virtual machines, idle virtual machines, et cetera. So the way you configure this is using pricing cards. So there's basically two ways of configuring pricing. So the first one is within, you can configure it natively in vRealize operations. So this applies to basically any virtual machine that's not managed by vRealize automation. And then the second option is actually defining the pricing card within vRealize automation. So this applies to any virtual machine that is managed by vRealize automation. So basically the way you define the pricing cards are the same across both UIs. It's just, it's basically two different ways of configuring it. And it's basically whether it's managed by VRA or not managed by VRA. Some of the important things to note here is, this pricing works on any virtual machine, regardless of what cloud it's running in. So this can be on-prem, it can be in VMC on AWS, AVS, GCVE, OCBS. It doesn't matter. The pricing will work on any cloud or any virtual machine. You can define your pricing cards based on cost or rate. No, it's the cost piece is the important one. You have to make sure that the costing for your cloud is correct if you want to base your pricing based on cost. But you also have the option of doing rate. Is basically is the same as doing from allocation based. But you can also define prices based on guest OS, vSphere tags. You can do one-time cost, recurring cost, prices, recurring prices. So there's a lot of different ways you can add in charges for virtual machines. So the tag one there is a very very powerful one. You can add things like upcharges for backups or upcharges for DR, etc. So I did mention vRealize automation. If you integrate the two products together, you will actually see the pricing information. You can see it both on vRealize operations, and you can see the same pricing information in vRealize automation. So vRealize operations is the pricing engine that powers the prices you see in vRealize automation. So it's really great when you connect the two together. You can see daily price estimates. So that's before you deploy some virtual machines. You can get an estimate of what the prices would be. And then once the VMs are deployed, then you can track the prices of those virtual machines over time. So it's a really cool integration using the pricing. So that's important to note. The integration with vRealize automation is based on pricing, not cost. It's based on price. And then the last thing I want to mention here is we do have a dashboard for comparing the VM's cost versus the price. So this is helpful when you want to go and verify your pricing cards are basically configured appropriately to recoup your costs. You want to make sure your prices are at least the same as costs, if not higher, depending on what services you provide and what additional money you need from a chargeback perspective. So this is a great dashboard to help do that kind of comparison. So the next thing I want to talk about is from a public cloud perspective. So previously, everything I've been talking about is for vSphere clouds. I just want to touch on public clouds really quick. So if you may or may not be aware, VMware has two different costing solutions. The one is vRealize operations, which is what I've been talking about so far. And then the other one is with Cloud Health. And I'll kind of talk about when you would use one versus the other. So if you are using public cloud, you basically have to have Cloud Health in order to look at the cost of your public clouds. If you want to look at any VMware-based cloud, so that could be on-prem, VMware Cloud on AWS, AVS, GCVE, OCBS, vCloud Director, Cloud Director Service, etc. So any vSphere-based cloud, then your solution would be VMware Cloud or vRealize Operations or vRealize Operations Cloud. So we're going to talk about what we can get from a public costing perspective. So this is through our integrations between vRealize Operations and Cloud Health. So if you install the Cloud Health Management Pack, you can actually go and bring in the cost of your native AWS, native Azure, and Google Cloud. You bring them in from Cloud Health and make them available in vRealize operations. So that gives you the ability to create dashboards and reports that go across all of the clouds. So whether it's on-prem, whether it's a VMware cloud from like a VMC, AVS, GCVE, or a native public cloud. So you can do it across all of those and create unified reports going across all of the clouds. One of the things that's important if you're a Cloud Health customer is perspectives. So the management pack actually does bring in the perspectives and the perspective groups. So you can actually create these groups and do your reporting based on those perspectives coming in from Cloud Health. So really powerful feature on the Cloud Health side. And then we just bring that into vRealize operations. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about from a Cloud Health perspective is there's another management pack called the Cloud Health Integration Management Pack. And this is the reverse. So if you have Cloud Health and you want to see the cost of your on-prem environment in Cloud Health, you can install this management pack, and this management pack will take the cost of your on-prem environments and push them into Cloud Health. So then now in Cloud Health, you can create these multi-cloud class reports as well. So you can show your native clouds plus your on-prem clouds with the data coming in from vRealize operations. Okay, and with that, that is the end of this session. I really appreciate your time today and hope you have a great day. Cheers.